Nancy Reeves stepped into the elegant restaurant with a feeling of quiet excitement. She had always been a busy mother, a devoted wife, and someone who had spent most of her life quietly in the background. But tonight, she was finally going to enjoy a peaceful dinner, a moment of calm to herself. She had heard great things about this upscale spot and thought it would be the perfect place to indulge after weeks of chaotic family life. The hostess greeted her with a warm smile and led her to a cozy corner booth. Nancy had a soft smile on her face as she settled in, the soft clinking of silverware and low hum of conversations around her providing a comforting atmosphere. It felt like a different world compared to her usual routine, away from the constant buzz of phone calls and the demands of her son, Keanu, who was busy with his Hollywood career. As Nancy looked over the menu, trying to decide what to order, she noticed a young man approaching her table. His appearance was sharp, but his expression seemed cold. "Good evening," the waiter said flatly. His name tag read, Ethan. "What can I get for you tonight?" Nancy looked up, surprised by his indifferent tone, but she smiled politely. "I'll have the salmon, please, and a glass of white wine if you have it." Ethan barely acknowledged her, jotting down her order with a quick flick of his pen. There was something about his demeanor that rubbed Nancy the wrong way. He didn't make eye contact, and his body language was stiff, almost as if he were annoyed to be serving her. But she brushed it off, thinking maybe he was just having a rough day. He didn't say another word, just turned on his heel and walked away without another glance. Nancy watched him go, a little confused. She wasn't used to being treated like this in such a fancy place, but she shrugged it off. Sitting back in her chair, Nancy sighed contentedly, trying to let go of the tension from her busy life. She didn't mind the silence. In fact, she was grateful for it. She had been Keanu's mom for so long, always in the background of his famous life, and tonight she was simply Nancy. Just as she was starting to relax, a sudden voice broke her moment of peace. "Excuse me, Mom," Ethan's voice came again, but this time it was sharper. "Did you need anything else?" Nancy glanced up, surprised by the interruption. "No, I think I'm all set for now, thank you." Ethan gave her a quick, dismissive nod. Before walking off again, his expression still cold. Nancy frowned, a sense of discomfort beginning to settle in her stomach. She wasn't sure why, but his attitude had rubbed her the wrong way. Was he always like this? As the minutes passed and her wine arrived, Nancy began to wonder whether she had chosen the right place. The service was far from what she had expected at such a high-end restaurant, but before she could dwell on it too much, Ethan returned. With her meal, his face now looking even more impatient. "Here you go," he said flatly, setting the plate down with barely a glance. Nancy, trying to keep things pleasant, smiled up at him. "Thank you." But Ethan didn't respond, instead turning to walk away once more, ignoring her completely. Nancy took a deep breath and tried to shake off the uncomfortable feeling that had been growing inside her. She had hoped for a relaxing night out, but something about this evening was starting to feel off. Little did she know this seemingly small interaction would soon take a dramatic turn. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward even when things get tough? Nancy tried to push away the odd feeling that lingered after Ethan's cold demeanor. She focused on her meal, savoring each bite of the perfectly cooked salmon. The flavors were exquisite, and she could feel herself beginning to unwind. Yet the unease was still there, tugging at the back of her mind. As she ate, she noticed Ethan moving about the restaurant, seemingly too busy to give her another glance. He was quick, almost robotic in his movements, darting from table to table but never with a hint of warmth. It wasn't long before Nancy realized that she wasn't the only one he was treating this way. The other customers seemed to be avoiding him, giving him polite but awkward smiles when he brought their orders, and he didn't seem to notice or care. But what really began to bother her was his complete lack of respect. When Nancy tried to flag him down to refill her wine glass, he brushed past her, without even acknowledging her request, instead focusing on a group of younger patrons who had just sat down at a nearby table. Nancy tried to hold it in, but something snapped inside her. She had spent most of her life being calm, accommodating, and understanding of others, but now this young man, this arrogant waiter, was testing her patience. She raised her hand slightly, hoping to catch his attention. When Ethan finally turned to face her, she smiled, trying to remain composed. "Excuse me. I'd appreciate it if you could refill my glass," she said, her tone polite but firm. Ethan's eyes flicked over to her without much enthusiasm. He didn't seem sorry for having ignored her earlier. Instead, he simply muttered, "In a minute," before turning to walk off. Nancy felt a flash of irritation, but she decided to let it slide. Hoping this would be the end of it, she returned to her meal, trying to regain her focus. But just as she took another bite of her salmon, she saw him again. This time he was speaking with a colleague, and their conversation was loud enough for her to overhear. "That woman over there," Ethan said, glancing her way, "is probably just some rich lady who thinks she can get whatever she wants. It's annoying to deal with people like her." Nancy's heart sank. She wasn't one to make a scene, but hearing this hit her harder than she expected. The tone in his voice, the way he dismissed her so casually, it was too much. She had been patient, understanding, and respectful, and yet here she was being treated like she was invisible or beneath him. The more she thought about it, the angrier she became. Who did this young man think he was? She stood up, her hand gripping the edge of the table as her emotions swirled. She had had enough. As she walked over to the host's stand to ask for the manager, Nancy's phone buzzed in her purse. She glanced down at the screen and saw that it was a text from Keanu. "How's dinner going, Mum? Hope you're relaxing, love you." Nancy smiled softly, her frustration momentarily forgotten as she typed back, "It's fine, just some weird service here. I'll tell you about it later." She put her phone back in her purse, but just as she turned to walk toward the manager's office, a voice called out from behind her. "Ma'am, I'm sorry to interrupt, but could you wait a moment?" It was Ethan. Nancy froze for a moment, unsure whether she should just ignore him or turn around and face him. Something about his voice, though, sounded different now, almost apologetic. Turning, slowly she saw him standing there, his posture more relaxed than before. His eyes, which had been cold just moments ago, now seemed to be avoiding hers. I just wanted to say that I'm sorry," he said, scratching the back of his neck awkwardly. "I didn't mean to offend you earlier. I've just been dealing with a lot of stuff today." Nancy blinked, taken aback by the sudden shift in his tone. Was he really apologizing? After everything that had happened, she hadn't expected this. But instead of softening, her frustration lingered. She couldn't just forget the way he had treated her. "I understand that you're busy," she said slowly, her voice steady, "but that doesn't excuse being rude to a customer. You don't know anything about me, so I would appreciate it if you treated me with some respect." Ethan's face flushed. For a moment he stood there in silence, his mouth opening and closing, as if trying to find the right words. But no words came. Finally he nodded, his face a mix of embarrassment and something else, guilt maybe. "You're right. I'm sorry, truly, I don't know why I acted like that." Nancy's expression softened slightly, but she wasn't ready to let it go completely. She crossed her arms, trying to keep her composure. "It's not just about today," she said quietly. "It's about understanding that everyone deserves respect, no matter who they are." Ethan nodded again, looking down. "I get it, I won't forget this." Nancy let out a deep breath, feeling the tension in her chest start to ease. She wasn't sure if Ethan had truly understood, or if this was just an empty apology. But at least he hadn't tried to defend his actions. That at least gave her some hope. Before she could say anything more, Ethan turned to walk away, but just before he did, he hesitated and turned back toward her. "I'll get you that refill now," he said, his tone much more respectful than before. Nancy watched as he walked off, her mind still racing. This wasn't over yet. Some things still didn't feel right about the whole situation. Nancy's heart was still racing as she returned to her table, glancing over her shoulder at Ethan, who now seemed genuinely apologetic. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this situation than just bad service. The brief moment of tension seemed to linger in the air, heavy and unresolved. As Ethan returned with her wine glass, refilling it carefully but with no further conversation, Nancy tried to focus on her meal, but the unease only grew stronger. She had never been one to create a scene, but something about the way Ethan had dismissed her, then quickly turned on a dime, unsettled her. Her mind began to wander. Maybe it was something deeper. Maybe this young man was struggling in his personal life, trying to make ends meet while working at the restaurant, taking out his frustrations on the wrong person. She'd heard stories of waitstaff being overworked and underpaid, but that didn't justify rudeness. Still, she wasn't here to play therapist. She was here to enjoy a quiet meal, to experience the luxury she'd never had time for. And yet, with every passing moment, the nagging discomfort wouldn't go away. Just then, she noticed Ethan standing at the corner of the restaurant, chatting with a colleague. The two exchanged what looked like private words, and she overheard something that stopped her in her tracks. "She's acting like she owns the place," Ethan said in a low voice, clearly not realizing that Nancy could hear. "Just another rich lady who thinks she can get whatever she wants." Nancy's face turned a deep shade of red. The words hit her like a slap in the face. She had been polite, she had been patient, but here he was, still judging her based on nothing more than a few polite requests. Her first instinct was to confront him right then and there, but something held her back. Maybe it was her own upbringing, the need to remain composed. Or maybe it was the small, quiet part of her that still hoped the situation could be salvaged without making things worse. But the anger was bubbling up inside her, and she couldn't ignore it any longer. She felt a deep sense of betrayal, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been treated like they were invisible, their worth judged by superficial standards. Nancy wasn't just Keanu Reeves's mother. She was a person, and she deserved respect like anyone else. Ethan's words echoed in her mind as she stood up from the table. She didn't even finish her meal. She was done. It wasn't just about the food or the service or the rudeness. It was about the principle. The world didn't need more judgment, more coldness, more people like him. Nancy stood and made her way toward the manager's office, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. She wasn't going to let him get away with this, not after everything she had endured. It wasn't the first time someone had treated her with disrespect, especially given her connection to Keanu, but tonight this young waiter had pushed her too far. As she neared the manager's office, Nancy felt a sudden tug on her sleeve. She turned sharply to see Ethan standing in her path, his face now flushed with embarrassment. I just wanted to apologize again," he said, his voice much more sincere than it had been before. "I didn't mean to offend you earlier. I don't know, I was wrong." Nancy looked him over carefully. His eyes were a mix of guilt and uncertainty, but she wasn't ready to forgive him yet. "It's not just about being offended," Nancy replied coolly. "It's about treating people with respect. You don't know anything about me and you made assumptions. That's not okay." Ethan nodded, clearly regretting his actions. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said that about you." "I don't know why." "I did. It was wrong. I was frustrated and it just slipped out." Nancy didn't answer immediately. She was torn. On the one hand, she wanted to believe him. On the other hand, there was a lingering feeling that this wasn't just about a one-time mistake. His attitude, his arrogance, seemed to run deeper than a single rude comment. Before she could speak again, a familiar voice interrupted them. "Is everything okay here?" The voice was warm and calm, and when Nancy turned, her eyes widened in surprise. Standing there with a calm smile on his face was Keanu Reeves. Ethan's face drained of color in an instant. His eyes widened, realizing who he was standing in front of. You're Keanu Reeves," Ethan stammered, his voice full of disbelief. I didn't realize." Keanu nodded casually, his gaze flicking between his mother and the now panicked waiter. "I take it everything's not going as smoothly as it should?" he asked, his voice steady and composed. Ethan stammered, his face flushed with embarrassment. I'm sorry, sir. I didn't mean—" Keanu raised a hand, cutting him off. "It's okay. My mom deserves respect just like anyone else, but I think you owe her a little more than an apology." Ethan swallowed hard, nodding fervently. "Yes, absolutely. I'm so sorry, Mom," he said to Nancy, his voice now trembling. Nancy stood there for a moment, processing what had just happened. Her son had arrived, and suddenly everything had changed. It was a simple reality check for Ethan, but it was also a sobering moment for Nancy. She had been judged and dismissed by someone who had no idea who she was. But in the end, it wasn't about Keanu being famous. It was about treating people with dignity. Nancy took a deep breath and met Ethan's gaze. "I appreciate the apology, and I hope you learn something from this," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. Ethan nodded vigorously, clearly grateful for her understanding. "I will. I promise." Keanu smiled at his mother and then turned back to Ethan. "I think we can leave it here, but remember, everyone deserves respect." Nancy nodded, still processing what had happened. As she turned to walk away with Keanu, she couldn't help but wonder, would Ethan really change? And if he did, would it be enough to make a difference in the world around him? As Nancy and Keanu walked out of the restaurant, Nancy couldn't help but replay the events in her head. Keanu's sudden appearance had shifted the entire atmosphere, and for a moment she had forgotten the tension that had built up in her over the last hour. She was proud of her son, always had been, but tonight it felt different. It wasn't just about his fame, his success. It was about the respect he brought with him everywhere he went. Keanu glanced over at her, sensing her quiet contemplation. "Are you okay, Mom?" he asked softly. Nancy smiled faintly, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm fine," she replied, her voice tinged with weariness. "Just tired of people making assumptions." Keanu nodded. He had seen the way people treated his mother when they didn't realize who she was. He'd witnessed it before, and each time it bothered him in ways he couldn't express. But tonight, it felt different. For once, it wasn't just about being famous. It was about standing up for the people we care about, for his mother, who had always quietly supported him from behind the scenes. When they reached the car, Nancy slid into the passenger seat, her mind still racing. "You know, I never thought I'd have to deal with something like this at my age," she said quietly, her voice soft but firm. "I've spent so many years in the background just supporting you and your career, but tonight I felt like I wasn't even seen. And the worst part was that it was so easy for him to dismiss me." Keanu looked over at her, his face filled with empathy. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said. "You shouldn't have to deal with that. It's not right, and it's definitely not the way people should treat others." Nancy nodded, her eyes staring out the window. "It's not just him, Keanu. It's how people treat others when they think no one is watching. It's the assumption that because I'm not famous like you, I don't deserve the same level of respect." Keanu reached over and placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "That's why I showed up. Sometimes people need a reminder. They need to understand that respect doesn't depend on who you know or how much money you have." Nancy smiled at him, grateful for his support. "I know, honey, and I appreciate it, but I also want to be able to stand on my own. I don't need anyone to fight my battles for me. I just want people to see me for who I am." Keanu squeezed her shoulder gently. "And they will, Mom. Maybe not right away, but they'll get it. People like Ethan, they'll learn. Sometimes it just takes a moment of realization, a small act that makes them see things differently." Nancy's thoughts drifted back to Ethan. Despite his apology, despite Keanu's intervention, something still bothered her. It wasn't just about the waiter. It was about the bigger picture. It was about the way people so often fail to see the worth of others based on superficial assumptions. And that was a cycle she was determined to break, one small action at a time. "I think I need to write a letter," Nancy said suddenly, as if she'd just come to a conclusion. Keanu raised an eyebrow, curious. "A letter? To Ethan?" She shook her head. "No, not to Ethan. To everyone who might have ever felt invisible. To anyone who's ever been dismissed because of who they are or where they come from." Keanu's face softened. "I think that's a good idea, Mom. Sometimes the most powerful things you can do come from the heart." Nancy smiled, feeling a spark of purpose light up inside her. She had always been a quiet force, always stood in the background. But maybe it was time for her voice to be heard. As they drove through the city, the night felt different. The tension from the restaurant had dissipated, replaced by something new, a sense of clarity, of understanding. Nancy wasn't just the mother of a famous actor. She wasn't just a woman who had been mistreated by a rude waiter. She was someone who had lived through the highs and lows of life, someone who understood the value of respect and the power of change. And tonight, she had made a difference, not just for herself, but for the countless others who had ever been overlooked or underestimated. Back at their home, Nancy sat down at the desk, pulling out a blank sheet of paper. She took a deep breath and began to write. Her words were clear, direct, and from the heart. She wrote about the importance of seeing people for who they truly were, not based on their status or appearances. She wrote about the power of kindness, about how small acts of respect could change the world around us. When she finished, she read through the letter again, feeling a sense of fulfillment. It wasn't just about standing up for herself. It was about standing up for everyone. And as she set the letter aside, ready to be sent off, Nancy realized that sometimes it wasn't the big things that made a difference. It was the small, everyday moments that had the power to create change. The next morning, Nancy woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. Her letter, which she had poured her heart into, was tucked neatly into her purse, ready to be sent out. She hadn't yet decided where to send it, perhaps to a public platform or even a blog that advocated for kindness and respect. What mattered was that her words had meaning, and she knew they could reach people who needed to hear them. As she sipped her coffee, Nancy thought about the events of the night before. The uncomfortable tension in the restaurant, Ethan's change of heart, Keanu's unexpected intervention. Everything had unfolded in a way she hadn't anticipated. But there was still a lingering thought in her mind, something that kept gnawing at her. Despite the apology from Ethan, something felt unfinished. Had he really changed, or was he simply apologizing because he realized who she was? Would he genuinely respect others in the future, or was this just an isolated incident, a moment where he'd realized the famous Keanu Reeves was sitting right in front of him? As she pondered these questions, her phone buzzed with a new message. The name on the screen made her heart skip a beat. It was from Ethan. "Hey Nancy, I hope you're doing well. I've been thinking a lot about what happened yesterday, and I wanted to apologize again. I didn't just disrespect you, I disrespected everyone who's ever been in your position. I don't want to be that person anymore. I'd like to make things right. If you're open to it, I'd love to meet you and talk more." Nancy stared at the message for a long moment, trying to process it. She hadn't expected this. After everything that had transpired, she thought it would be a one-time apology. One of those fleeting, awkward moments that didn't lead to much more. But Ethan's message felt different. There was sincerity in his words, an openness to change that she hadn't sensed the night before. She placed the phone down and thought about it. Was this a real turning point for him? Was he truly ready to make a change, to reconsider the way he viewed the world? Nancy had always believed in second chances, but something inside her told her this wasn't just about Ethan anymore. It was about what kind of person she wanted to be. Would she accept his apology, or would she continue to walk away from situations like this, brushing them off as just another disappointment? Taking a deep breath, Nancy typed a response. "Ethan, thank you for reaching out. I appreciate your words and your sincerity. I think it takes courage to recognize when we've made mistakes, and I respect that. If you're truly ready to change, then I'd be open to meeting and talking more. Let me know when works for you." Nancy hit send, and as the message was delivered, she felt a strange weight lift from her shoulders. It wasn't about forgiving him. It was about showing that change was possible, that people could grow and learn from their mistakes. A few minutes later, her phone buzzed again. It was Ethan. "Thank you, Nancy. I'm really looking forward to it. How about tomorrow afternoon? I'll make sure to pick a place that's quiet, somewhere we can have a real conversation." Nancy smiled, a small sense of satisfaction warming her. It wasn't just about the apology. It was about the potential for real change. She didn't know where this would lead, but it felt like the beginning of something more than just an apology. It felt like the possibility of a shift in perspective, both for Ethan and for herself. The next day they met at a quiet cafe, a small, unassuming spot on the edge of town. Nancy arrived a little early, her hands wrapped around a cup of hot tea as she waited for Ethan to show up. She wasn't sure what to expect. Would he be nervous? Would this conversation feel awkward? Would he really be able to back up his words? As she sat there, she couldn't help but think back to the previous day. Ethan had been so sure of himself in the restaurant, so quick to dismiss her, but today he was coming to her on his own terms, without the walls he had built around himself. And for the first time, Nancy felt like he was truly open to change. A few minutes later, Ethan walked in, looking a little out of place in the quiet setting. His hair was slightly tousled, and he was dressed in a simple t-shirt and jeans, looking far less polished than he had the night before in his waiter uniform. But there was a softness in his expression, a vulnerability that had been missing before. "Hi," Ethan said, his voice tentative. "I hope I'm not too early." Nancy smiled and motioned to the empty chair across from her. "Not at all, I'm glad you came." Ethan took a seat, his hands nervously fidgeting in his lap. "I wasn't sure what to expect today. I know I messed up yesterday, and I'm sorry again. I never should have treated you the way I did." Nancy nodded, taking a sip of her tea. "I appreciate your apology, Ethan, but it's not just about that. It's about understanding why it happened in the first place. Why we sometimes treat people poorly without even thinking about it." Ethan looked down, clearly reflecting on her words. "Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about that. I've been acting like I'm entitled to everything, like I'm better than people around me. And I know that's not right. I guess I thought I had it all figured out, you know? But when you called me out on it, I realized I was just hiding behind this attitude, thinking I could get away with it." Nancy leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "The thing is, Ethan, we all have a choice. You can choose to keep living like that, or you can choose to change. But change takes effort. It takes being uncomfortable, owning up to your mistakes, and learning from them. It's not just about apologizing, it's about doing better next time." Ethan nodded slowly, taking in her words. "I want to do better. I don't want to keep making the same mistakes." Nancy smiled. "That's a good place to start." For the next hour, they talked. They talked about life, about the pressures that had shaped Ethan's attitude, about the way people sometimes hide behind masks to protect themselves. They talked about change, and how it wasn't easy, but how it was worth it. As the conversation came to an end, Nancy stood up to leave. She could tell Ethan had learned something important, something he would carry with him moving forward. But more than that, she felt like she had made a difference. She had given him the chance to reflect, to understand the importance of kindness and respect. When they parted ways, she felt a sense of peace. Sometimes it wasn't the big dramatic moments that mattered most. It was the quiet conversations that had the power to spark change. A week had passed since Nancy and Ethan's conversation at the cafe. She couldn't help but wonder whether he had truly absorbed the lessons they'd discussed, whether the change he spoke of would actually take root in his life. It wasn't easy to transform one's attitude overnight, especially when habits had been built over years of frustration, judgment, and self-doubt. But for Nancy, this was part of the process. Change didn't come with instant results. It came with time, with effort, and with small, consistent actions. She had learned that lesson long ago, long before she became the mother of Keanu Reeves. She had seen it in her own life, the way things shifted when you were willing to confront your flaws, when you were open to growth. It wasn't always immediate, but it was always possible. It was a quiet afternoon when her phone rang, breaking her from her thoughts. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, and for a moment Nancy wondered whether she should answer. But something inside her urged her to pick up. "Hello," she answered. "Hi, is this Nancy?" a voice asked, somewhat hesitant. "This is she. Who's calling?" "This is Ethan from the restaurant," he said. There was an odd mix of nervousness and excitement in his voice. "I hope it's okay that I'm calling. I just wanted to tell you something." Nancy leaned back in her chair, intrigued. Of course, Ethan, what's on your mind?" "Well, I've been thinking a lot about our conversation, and I wanted to let you know that I've actually started making some changes. I've been working on my attitude, being kinder, more patient, less judgmental, and I wanted to thank you. I don't think I would have started doing any of that if it wasn't for you." Nancy felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words. She had hoped he was serious, but hearing him say it, hearing him take accountability for his actions, made it real. "I'm really glad to hear that, Ethan," she said, her voice calm and steady. "But remember, it's not about being perfect. It's about continuing to try. Every day is a chance to do better." Ethan's voice cracked slightly, as though he was overwhelmed with emotion. "I know, and I'm not expecting to change overnight. But I really want to keep trying. And I wanted to let you know that I've been more mindful of how I treat people. Even the customers at work. I've been taking more time to listen, to not judge them based on appearances or assumptions." Nancy smiled softly, proud of the young man she had helped guide. "That's the right path, Ethan. It won't always be easy, but you're making progress, and I'm proud of you for sticking with it." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and Nancy could sense that Ethan was grappling with something. "More. I was wondering," he said finally, "if you'd be willing to meet again. I don't know if this is too forward, but I was hoping we could talk more. Maybe even grab coffee again, just to continue our conversation." Nancy thought for a moment. She had been hesitant at first, unsure of whether this was a real change or just a fleeting moment. But now, hearing him take responsibility, hearing the sincerity in his voice, it made her believe that he was ready to continue growing. "I'd be happy to meet again," Nancy said, smiling warmly. "Let's pick a day. We can talk more. But remember, it's not about getting it right all at once, it's about the effort." "Of course," Ethan replied quickly. "I know. Thank you so much, Nancy. You've already helped me more than you know." As they made plans for the next meeting, Nancy hung up the phone, feeling a sense of peace settle over her. She had always known that change took time, but this small step felt like a sign that things were heading in the right direction. A few days later, they met again, this time at a quiet park bench overlooking a small pond. Ethan looked different. From the young man Nancy had met at the restaurant, he was still the same person, but there was a gentleness to him now, a softness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. It was as though he had let go of something heavy, something that had been weighing him down for a long time. They sat in silence for a few moments, the sounds of birds chirping and leaves rustling in the wind filling the space between them. It was a peaceful kind of quiet, the kind that made it easy to reflect. "So," Nancy said after a while, breaking the silence, "how have things been since we last talked?" Ethan smiled, a hint of pride in his expression. "Honestly, better. I've been more patient with people, more patient with myself too. I've started reading books on kindness, on how to be more mindful. I realized that it wasn't just about how I treated others, but how I treated myself too." Nancy nodded thoughtfully. "That's an important realization, Ethan. A lot of people overlook that. We can't show kindness to others if we don't show it to ourselves first." Ethan paused, looking down at his hands. "I guess that's part of the reason I wanted to thank you. You didn't just help me understand how I should treat others. You helped me see how much I've been neglecting myself, how much I've been holding on to anger and frustration for no reason. I think I've been using that anger to hide from my own fears." Nancy's heart softened. She had always known that Ethan had a lot more going on beneath the surface. Everyone did. We all carried hidden burdens, unspoken fears, things we didn't always want others to see. But it was through conversations like this, honest, open, and raw, that people could truly begin to heal. "It's okay to be vulnerable," Nancy said gently. "We all have fears, but it's what we choose to do with them that matters. And it sounds like you're starting to face them head on." Ethan smiled, his eyes meeting hers with newfound clarity. "Yeah, I guess I am. Thanks, Nancy. You've taught me more than I can put into words." They sat in silence again, not awkward but comfortable. A few moments later, Nancy stood up, brushing the dirt from her pants. "I think you're on the right track, Ethan," she said warmly. "Just keep doing the work. It's all about progress, not perfection." He nodded. "I will, I promise." As they said their goodbyes, Nancy couldn't help but feel a sense of fulfillment. Maybe she wasn't the one who had changed Ethan completely, but she had been part of his journey, and that was enough. As Nancy drove home, she thought about everything that had happened, the restaurant, the tension, the apology, and now this moment. She realized that sometimes we have the opportunity to change the lives of others just by being present, by offering a kind word, or simply by listening. And maybe, just maybe, that was the true power of connection. Weeks went by, and life slowly began to settle into a new rhythm for Nancy. As the days turned into months, she found herself thinking more and more about the ripple effect of her actions. She had helped Ethan, yes, but that was just the beginning. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more at play, more change waiting to happen if she could continue doing what she was doing. Nancy had always been a woman who believed in the power of small acts of kindness. The idea that even the tiniest gesture could set off a chain of events that would have lasting effects. It wasn't just some feel-good idea. She had seen it in action. It had happened to her family, and she knew deep down that the smallest sparks of change could lead to something much bigger. But now, Nancy had begun to wonder, was this just about Ethan? Or was there something more that she was supposed to do with the lessons she had learned? She had spent years helping her son, Keanu, navigate the complexities of fame and the world's expectations, but now she was being reminded of something vital. Kindness and understanding were universal, and anyone, no matter their situation, could benefit from a little compassion. It was a Saturday afternoon when Nancy received another unexpected call. This time, it wasn't Ethan. The caller ID read, Keanu. Nancy's heart skipped a beat, as it always did when she saw her son's name appear on the screen. It had been a while since they had talked. Keanu had been busy with work and hadn't had much free time. But when he called, it always felt like a moment of connection that could bring clarity, no matter how long it had been since their last conversation. "Hi, sweetie," Nancy answered, her voice filled with warmth. "Hey, Mom," Keanu replied. His voice sounded different than usual, softer, a little uncertain. "I wanted to talk to you about something. Do you have a minute?" "Of course," she said, settling into a chair by the window. "What's on your mind?" Keanu sighed, and she could tell something was weighing on him. "I've been thinking a lot about something recently. I know this might sound odd, but I've been reflecting on the way people treat others, especially in the industry. There's so much pressure to be perfect, to be someone people admire. But I'm starting to see how that pressure can make people forget to be kind. It makes them forget about the importance of empathy, of just being a decent human being." Nancy's chest tightened with a mix of pride and concern. She had always known that Keanu, despite his fame, carried a heart that was often hidden behind the public persona. But hearing him speak so openly about this, especially in the context of the pressures he faced, made her realize how deeply he had internalized the very lessons she had tried to impart to him. "I know exactly what you mean, honey," Nancy said gently. "People often forget that the world doesn't revolve around perfection. It's the imperfections, the moments of vulnerability, that make us human. And sometimes people need to be reminded that kindness is the real measure of strength." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and Nancy could almost feel the weight of Keanu's thoughts pressing against her. "Mom, I think I've spent so much of my life trying to please everyone, trying to live up to an ideal image of what a person should be. But I'm starting to realize that it's not about that. It's about doing the right thing, even when it's hard, even when no one's looking." Her heart swelled with emotion. "I'm so proud of you, Keanu. You've always had a big heart, and I've always known that the real you is far more important than any image the world tries to create." "I know, Mom," he said, his voice softening. "And that's why I've been thinking about it more lately. I've been wanting to do something more, to take those lessons of kindness and empathy and to do more with them. I don't want to just talk about it. I want to show people what it means to really care." Nancy smiled to herself, so proud of her son. He had always been driven, but now she could hear the fire of purpose in his voice. She knew he was ready to take the next step, just like she had once done, embracing the change that would make a difference in the world, even if it meant stepping out of his comfort zone. "You already are showing people, Keanu," she said. "You just don't always see it. Every time you show kindness, every time you speak out about empathy, you're setting an example. But if you want to do more, I believe you can. You've got the heart for it." Keanu took a deep breath. I think I think I want to start by doing something small, something that could really help others. I've been thinking about charity, work, about reaching out to people who don't have the platform I do. Maybe we could work together on something." Nancy's heart skipped a beat. She could feel the excitement building. Keanu had always been passionate about giving back, but hearing him talk about it like this, it was different. It was personal, and it was real. "I'd love that, Keanu," Nancy replied. "Let's think about how we can make it happen, together." And just like that, the idea of a new beginning took shape. It wasn't just about Ethan or her. It was about all of them. The people who had been affected by one moment of kindness, who had the potential to reach others and spark even more change. The ripple effect had already begun, and now it was. Time to expand it. Over the next few weeks, Nancy and Keanu began brainstorming ideas for a project that would spread kindness and empathy, starting with small communities and expanding from there. They decided to create a non-profit organization focused on providing support to those who felt overlooked, whether through food banks, job placement programs, or mental health initiatives. They wanted to remind people that kindness could be as powerful as any celebrity endorsement. Meanwhile, Ethan, who had been diligently working on his own personal growth, became involved in the project as well. He had gone from the arrogant waiter to someone who was eager to make a tangible difference. His role in the project was simple at first, volunteering his time and helping organize events. But Nancy could see how deeply he had committed to making real, lasting change in the world. As they worked together, the project began to take off. They organized charity events, collaborated with local businesses, and reached out to people who wanted to make a difference but didn't know where to start. The ripple effect was growing. Nancy looked at the work they were doing, the people they were helping, and felt an overwhelming sense of purpose. This was bigger than anything she had ever imagined. It wasn't just about changing one person's life. It was about creating a movement and the beauty of it all. It had all started with a single moment of kindness. As the weeks passed, Nancy and Keanu's project blossomed. What had started as a simple conversation between mother and son had grown into something much bigger than they had ever anticipated. The non-profit organization, which they had named Ripple of Kindness, began to take on a life of its own. They had volunteers from all walks of life, people eager to make a difference, eager to be part of something bigger than themselves. Ethan, too, was becoming more and more involved, stepping up to help with outreach and logistics. His transformation, which had once seemed improbable, was now evident to everyone around him. He had gone from the cynical, abrasive waiter to a man who believed in the power of kindness. The shift in his demeanor was palpable. His interactions with people were warmer, his smile more genuine. Even the customers at the restaurant, who had once felt the sting of his sharp remarks, were beginning to notice the change. But it wasn't just the outward changes that were important. It was the internal shifts that Nancy had seen in Ethan. He was a living example of how one person's actions could ripple out and change everything around them. It wasn't just Nancy or Keanu who had sparked that change. It was Ethan's willingness to embrace it and let it transform his life. The organization's first charity event was just around the corner. They had arranged for a large fundraising dinner at a venue in downtown Los Angeles, with all proceeds going to help feed the homeless and provide support for people struggling with mental health issues. Keanu was scheduled to speak at the event, and the media had already caught wind of the cause. They were eager to interview him, to get a glimpse of the man behind the Hollywood icon. Nancy knew that this event was a critical moment for their mission. It was an opportunity to reach a larger audience, to spread the message of kindness and empathy to people who might not have considered it before. Keanu was ready, but he also felt the weight of the responsibility. Public appearances were nothing new for him, but speaking about something so personal, something that came from his heart, was a different kind of challenge. A few days before the event, Nancy and Keanu were sitting in the living room of her home, going over the final details for the evening. Keanu was pacing back and forth, clearly a little nervous. "You're going to do great," Nancy reassured him, watching him with a knowing smile. "You have a way of reaching people. You always have. Keanu stopped pacing and looked at her. I know. But this feels different. This isn't about acting or playing a role. This is about something real, something that matters. I want to make sure I say the right thing. Nancy could see the tension in his face, the weight of his inner struggle. She stood up and walked over to him, placing a hand gently on his shoulder. You don't have to be perfect, Keanu. Just speak from your heart. That's all anyone wants to hear. He smiled at her, his expression softening. Thanks, Mom. I needed to hear that. The night of the charity event arrived, and the venue was filled with energy and excitement. The atmosphere was electric as guests mingled, chatting about the cause and the amazing work Ripple of Kindness had been doing. Nancy stood at the entrance, greeting people with a warm smile, but her eyes kept darting to the stage where Keanu would soon speak. As the event kicked off, Nancy couldn't help but feel proud of everything they had accomplished. The event had exceeded all expectations, and the room was filled with people who truly believed in the mission. The music, the food, the laughter, everything felt like it was coming together perfectly. When it was finally Keanu's turn to speak, the room fell silent. He stepped up to the podium, and Nancy's heart swelled with pride. Her son, the man who had once struggled with the pressure of the world's expectations, was now using his platform to inspire real change. Keanu took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the room full of people who had come to support the cause. He wasn't playing a role tonight. This was him, raw and vulnerable, speaking from the depths of his soul. Good evening, everyone, he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. I'm here tonight not as a celebrity or a public figure, but as a human being, just like all of you. And I want to talk about something that I think we've all forgotten. At some point, kindness. He paused for a moment, letting the word hang in the air. You see, we live in a world where people are constantly told to be something they're not, to live up to expectations that are impossible to meet. And in that process, we lose sight of the simple things, of showing empathy, of offering a hand to those who need it most, of truly caring for one another. But I've learned something important over the years. Kindness is not a weakness. It is the most powerful force we have, and it can change the world, one small act at a time. The room was still, every person listening intently. Keanu's words were landing deep and true. That's why I'm so proud of what we're doing here tonight. Ripple of Kindness isn't just a charity. It's a movement to remind people that kindness matters. To remind people that no matter where you come from, no matter what challenges you face, you have the power to make a difference. And that's why I'm asking all of you to join us. Let's not just talk about change. Let's create it. There was a moment of silence before the room erupted in applause. Nancy's eyes glistened with tears, pride swelling in her chest as she watched her son inspire others with words that carried real weight. As the event came to a close, Nancy stood by the door, thanking the last of the guests as they left. Keanu approached her, a smile on his face, his eyes bright with the excitement of the night's success. You did great, sweetheart, Nancy said, her voice filled with pride. You touched so many people tonight. Keanu grinned, his usual modesty shining through. I was just saying what's been on my mind for a while, but I couldn't have done it without you, Mom. Nancy placed a hand on his arm, squeezing it gently. We did it together, and that's what it's all about. Helping others, showing kindness, it all adds up. As they drove home that night, Nancy reflected on everything that had transpired. Ethan had found his path. Keanu was stepping into his own sense of purpose, and Ripple of Kindness was growing beyond their wildest expectations. One act of kindness, one conversation, had created a chain of events that had the potential to change lives. And it was just the beginning. The weeks that followed the charity event felt like a whirlwind. Ripple of Kindness was now a well-established name, and the impact they were making was palpable. From funding shelters for the homeless to offering workshops on emotional well-being, the organization's reach was spreading far beyond what Nancy and Keanu had initially imagined. Every day felt like a new chapter, a new opportunity to change the world, one person at a time. But the work wasn't easy. It was demanding, exhausting at times, and filled with challenges they had never anticipated. Nancy often found herself up late at night, reviewing plans for the next event, or replying to emails from potential donors. Keanu, despite his celebrity status, threw himself into the work just as passionately. The fame he had once dreaded now seemed like a tool for good, a way to bring attention to causes that truly mattered. But there was one thing that kept both of them grounded, the overwhelming sense that they were doing something meaningful. One late afternoon, Keanu arrived at Nancy's house after a long day of meetings. He looked weary but exhilarated. As he walked into the kitchen, he found Nancy sipping her tea at the kitchen counter. "Hey, Mom," he greeted her, his voice full of energy despite the day's long hours. "How's everything going on your end?" Nancy looked up at him, her face lighting up with a soft smile. "It's going well. You know, same old. Lots of organizing, phone calls and planning. But it feels good. Really good. How about you? How was the meeting with the new partners?" Keanu sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It went well, but it was a little overwhelming. The more people get involved, the more responsibility we have to make sure everything stays aligned with our mission. I think we're doing the right thing, but sometimes it feels like there's so much pressure to keep up with it all." Nancy nodded, understanding exactly how he felt. She had seen him carry the weight of the world on his shoulders before. Now it was just in a different way, but she also saw how deeply committed he was to the cause. She had always known her son was driven, but there was something uniquely beautiful about watching him use that drive to help others. "It's a lot, I know," she said, placing a reassuring hand on his arm. "But remember, Keanu, you don't have to carry it all alone. You've got a team behind you, people who believe in what we're doing, and you've got me. We'll get through it together, just like we always do." Keanu smiled, a hint of relief crossing his face. "Thanks, Mom. It helps to hear that. Sometimes I feel like I'm the one who needs to lead everything. But I know I can't do it all. I'm lucky to have you by my side." Nancy squeezed his arm gently, her heart full. "We're in this together. Always have been. Always will be." But even as they leaned into their shared purpose, the realization that the journey was far from over settled in. They had made significant strides, but there was still so much more to be done. They still had people to reach, lives to touch, and communities to uplift. It was in that quiet moment, sitting at her kitchen counter with her son, that Nancy thought about the past, the struggles, the hardships, the moments when she had felt unsure of her place in the world. She had been a mother, a mentor, a friend. And now, in this new chapter of her life, she was also a change maker. She had helped her son navigate fame, and together they had found a way to use that fame to create positive change. But it wasn't just Keanu who had grown from this journey. It was Nancy, too. She had rediscovered a part of herself, the part of her that was willing to risk everything for something bigger than her own comfort zone. She had seen firsthand how even the smallest act of kindness could have a ripple effect. And she was now living proof of that. The phone rang, breaking her thoughts. It was a call she had been waiting for, an update on a new partnership they were hoping to finalize. Nancy picked up the phone, her pulse quickening as she listened to the good news. "Yes, I'll get the paperwork over to you right away. Thank you so much for your support. This will change everything for us." As she hung up, she couldn't help but laugh, a genuine laugh that came from a place of joy and satisfaction. Keanu looked at her, his brow raised in curiosity. "Good news?" he asked. "The best," she replied. "Another partner just came on board. It's going to make a huge difference in how we can expand our reach." Keanu's face broke into a grin. "That's amazing, Mum. See, this is exactly why we're doing this. It's all coming together." Nancy nodded, feeling the truth of his words settle deep within her. "It is. And you know what? It's only just beginning." Later that evening, Nancy sat alone for a few minutes, reflecting on how far they had come. She thought about Ethan, who had found a new sense of purpose in his life. She thought about Keanu, who was finally stepping into his own strength, using his platform to make a real difference. And she thought about the people they had already helped, the families who had found shelter, the individuals who had found support when they needed it most. And as she thought, she realized something else, something profound. The ripple effect had never been about just one person. It had never been about the fame or the recognition or even the success. It had been about creating something that outlasted them, something that would continue to spread kindness long after they were gone. In that moment, Nancy felt a sense of peace. She had made her mark, and more importantly, she had helped others make theirs. The world was changing, one act of kindness at a time. As she stood up to join Keanu in the living room, ready to dive back into their work, she felt a deep sense of contentment. This was their new beginning, and it was only just the beginning.